I'm Kendall Sharp, and the night my husband hit me, I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I didn't even move. He stood over me, waiting for the old version of me, the woman who apologized for everything to come crawling back. But I stayed silent, not because I was afraid, but because something inside me finally snapped in a way he couldn't see. And the next morning, when he came downstairs expecting obedience, expecting me to play my part again, he walked into the dining room, saw who was sitting at the table, and his face went pale. That was the moment he realized my silence wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of his downfall. Traverse Bay has a way of convincing people that life here is softer than it really is. Maybe it's the small-town smiles or the way neighbors wave from their porches even when the wind cuts hard off the lake. Whatever the reason, everyone seemed certain that the Sharp household was exactly what it looked like from the sidewalk, steady, enviable, the kind of place people pointed to as proof that good marriages still existed. I used to wish they were right. Inside our home, nothing felt gentle. Everything in my life seemed to be organized around an unspoken set of rules I hadn't agreed to, but had learned to obey. What I wore, who I spent time with, how long I lingered after work, none of it was really mine to decide. If I questioned anything, I'd get an answer wrapped in reassurance, the kind that sounded responsible on the surface, but left a knot in my stomach long after the conversation ended. It wasn't always like that. The shift happened slowly, almost quietly. The way the first sheets of ice creep across the lake in November, by the time I noticed things tightening around me, the change in him had already taken root. His posture grew more rigid, his expectations sharper, even in public, where he was all warmth and charm. I'd feel the pressure of his hand on my shoulder guiding me where he wanted me to stand. I remember one evening more clearly than the others. I paused at our front steps, staring through the window at the soft gold light spilling across the living room. My heart beat faster than it should have, as if it sensed a truth I kept pushing aside. I told myself I was just tired, that I was overthinking things, that every couple had tense seasons, but deep down, I knew the ground beneath my marriage had already begun to crack. What I didn't know, not yet, was how quickly those cracks would open, or how the silence I'd been living in would turn out to be the only thing standing between me and the storm waiting ahead. Just when I thought things had settled into a strange, uneasy routine, Grant found new ways to shrink the space I moved in. It started small. So small I almost blamed myself. One evening I opened the cabinet and saw the spice jars lined up in a different pattern. At first, I chalked it up to being distracted after work. But the next day, they shifted again, and again the day after that. Nothing dramatic, just enough for me to feel the prickle of being watched, judged, corrected in ways that couldn't be named out loud. Whenever something wasn't in the position he had silently chosen, Grant didn't yell. He didn't slam anything. He simply looked at me with an expression that said he knew I had failed him, even if I didn't know how. One night, I dropped a glass while rinsing dishes. It slipped from my fingers and shattered across the tile. I froze, waiting for the explosion. Instead, he appeared in the doorway, hands in his pockets. He studied the shards on the floor, then lifted his eyes to mine and said he couldn't always be there to keep an eye on me. No anger, no rise in his voice, just a quiet sentence that somehow weighed more than a scream. Then he turned and walked away. A week later, I found a tiny camera lodged behind the potted plant in the hallway. At first, I convinced myself it was part of our home security, but then I found another behind the bookshelf, and a third tucked above the pantry door, all aimed inward, all aimed at me. Grant brushed it off as a precaution against break-ins, but the only thing those cameras protected was his sense of ownership. I felt like I was living inside a glass enclosure, every movement cataloged, every silence measured. The final confirmation came the afternoon I logged into my bank account at the library. My entire balance had been transferred into the account Grant controlled. The password had been changed. I stared at the reset prompt, hands trembling, and typed in the date of his award ceremony on a hunch. It opened instantly. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a message. In this house, in this marriage, he alone dictated the terms. My breath hitched as I closed the laptop. I realized then that the walls closing in on me weren't imaginary. They were built, brick, by someone who never needed to raise his voice to make sure I stayed exactly where he wanted me. After discovering the cameras and the empty bank account, I started paying attention to the quiet moments inside our home. Not because I wanted to challenge anything, but because the silence itself had begun to frighten me more than Grant's temper. One night, he left his phone on the sofa. It buzzed once, lighting up the room with a soft glow. I would have ignored it, but my name caught my eye. A message from one of his coworkers asked if I had settled down yet. My hands moved before my mind did, tapping the screen open. The thread hit me like a cold blade. He told them I needed to be reminded of my place. He told them he had been too forgiving. One of them encouraged him not to let me step out of line. Reading those words felt like standing outside my own life, watching people I barely knew discuss how to manage me as if I were a problem to be fixed. My shoulders tightened, and I felt a chill sweep across my back. The same kind of chill the wind carried off the lake on the worst winter days. The following afternoon, he came home unexpectedly early and dropped his work bag on the kitchen table with a heavy thud. I flinched without meaning to. He asked if I had touched his phone. I said no. He stared long enough for the air between us to feel taut, then went upstairs and slammed the bedroom door so hard the picture frames rattled on the wall. Later, when I was gathering laundry, I found a receipt crumpled in the pocket of his uniform. It was for new locks and a hidden camera, the kind used by private investigators, before I could process what that meant. He called my name from downstairs, his tone steady in a way that made my pulse quicken. When I stepped to the bottom stair, he wrapped his arms around me and kissed the top of my head like nothing in the world was wrong. But the warmth didn't fool me. That embrace wasn't affection, it was strategy. Grant already knew I had discovered something he never meant for me to see, and behind that gentle facade, I could feel the ground shifting, pushing me toward the only path left, finding a way out before he closed every exit he could. After the night I saw Grant's messages with his coworkers, the quiet in our house changed shape. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It pressed against my ribs, heavy and cold, the same way the first winter air rolled off Traverse Bay and slipped into every unsealed crack. Grant still laughed easily when he stepped outside each morning, but when the door closed, my breathing shifted into something tight and shallow, as if every corner of the house held its own warning. That evening, the temperature dropped fast enough for the lake to start skinning over with ice. I warmed a simple bowl of soup, hoping the routine would settle my nerves. The moment the front door slammed hard, the spoon trembled in my hand. Grant came in unsteady, eyes bloodshot like he'd been shouting long before he got home. He walked straight toward me, voice low, asking who I talked to that day. I told him the truth. He tore open cabinet drawers anyway, searching for proof of a conversation I never had. When I set the bowl down, his fingers wrapped around my wrist, not bruising, but cold and deliberate. He murmured that he would always know if I spoke to someone I wasn't supposed to. I stood silent, offering nothing. I thought the moment had passed, but when I turned toward the sink, he shoved me hard enough that my shoulder cracked against the counter's sharp edge. Pain shot up my neck, metallic on my tongue as I swallowed it back. In my silence, something shifted in his eyes. Confusion, maybe even fear. Later, when he went upstairs, I heard the turn of a lock on the bedroom door. He had never locked it before. I stayed at the kitchen table, palm pressed over the red mark on my wrist, knowing the night had changed more than just the weather. Sleep didn't come. Moonlight carved thin shadows across the floor, stretching like hands reaching toward me. My shoulder throbbed, but the ache only sharpened my thoughts. I realized the only weapon I had left was the silence he'd trained me into. I slipped into the bathroom and photographed the swelling on my skin, adding it to the hidden folder I'd been building. This time, I sent a copy to Ava along with a warning, my first real-time record. I pulled out the old laptop from the shoe cabinet and downloaded the logs from the hidden cameras he placed around the house. Every click felt like stealing from a man who believed he owned every corner of my world. Then a notification flashed. Grant had just replayed footage of me in the kitchen from earlier that evening. I shut the laptop instantly, heart kicking hard. He knew I was awake. He knew I was moving. I dimmed the lights and tucked myself behind the dining table, gripping the USB in my palm. Floorboards creaked upstairs. His steps moved toward the stairs, not away from them. He walked into the dark kitchen and sat at the table only feet from me, elbows resting, head in his hands. Minutes stretched thin. Then he spoke, soft and certain. He said he knew what I was doing. He rose, went upstairs, never looking my way. I stayed in the dark, clutching the USB. Knowing my silence was no longer survival, it was the first blow in a war he didn't see coming. The morning after, Grant sat in the dark, whispering that he knew what I was doing. I woke with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I wanted the truth to collapse right in front of him, in front of the people who believed he was incapable of harm. And the perfect opportunity arrived with the brunch he insisted on hosting for his crew before their winter training check at the lake. I moved through the kitchen quietly, letting the smell of cinnamon and melted butter drift through the house the way he liked. On the outside, I looked like the wife he expected me to be. Inside, every step felt like positioning pieces on a board he didn't know we were playing. When Ava walked in with Officer Briggs, they blended in like ordinary guests. Only I knew Ava carried the protective order, and Briggs was there to document anything Grant tried to pull. I hadn't warned him. The silence between us was strategy now, upstairs. He took far too long to get ready, drawers opening, something thudding against a wall. Footsteps pacing tight circles. He came down wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, brushing a hand across my shoulder as if he owned the room. He murmured that staying calm was best, confident I had folded again. But when he stepped into the kitchen and saw Ava, Briggs, and the folder on the table, his face drained faster than lake water in a storm drain. His smile died mid-breath. He froze, caught between pretending and fleeing. Ava's voice cut the tension as she tapped the folder, telling him they needed to talk after the meal. His crew stared in confusion, whispering among themselves. Then Zach moved beside me, rubbing a faint bruise on his wrist. He said quietly that Grant hadn't only done this to me. The truth was spreading, and Grant felt it. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. My silence settled over him like the ice forming on Traverse Bay. And for the first time, he had no idea how to break it. The moment the brunch ended, the department ordered Grant to leave for 48 hours while they reviewed concerns. He slammed the door behind him, but the sound wasn't power. It was panic. Men like him don't surrender control. They simply find new ways to take it back. That evening, as I walked home from the library, I saw his old fire truck parked under a leafless maple. The headlights were off, but I recognized the silhouette in the driver's seat. Watching, waiting. By the time Briggs arrived, the truck was gone. Later, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. 2 words. Still yours. It felt like ice sliding down my spine. The next morning, Dana showed up outside the library, clutching a stack of documents. Her voice shook as she recounted how he'd hurt her, apologized, then hurt her again. She signed her statement for Ava with trembling hands. That evening, Zach called me to meet outside, slipping a USB into my palm. The clip showed Grant drunk, slamming a locker and shouting inches from a coworker's face, proof he'd done this long before me. I barely shut my front door before hearing a scrape outside, a shuffle through leaves. A shadow stretched across the floor. Then his whisper seeped under the doorframe, soft and poisonous, telling me he knew exactly what I was doing. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I ran to the laundry room, shoved the vacuum against the door, and dialed Briggs with shaking fingers. Metal scraped at the back lock. Then glass shattered. Grant wasn't waiting for consequences. He was coming for me himself. The sound hit the house like an explosion. 1 second, everything was still, and the next, glass was raining across the floor. I didn't need to look to know it was him. Grant wasn't trying to scare me anymore. He was inside the line he'd never crossed. And he wasn't stopping. I ran to the laundry room, shoved the vacuum against the door, and tried to dial Briggs. But my hands shook so violently I could barely tap the screen. When the call connected, all she heard was my breath scraping in and out. She told me to lock the door and hold on. I did both. though neither felt like they'd save me. His footsteps moved across the hardwood, slow and controlled, as if he wanted me to hear every step. Then he said my name in a voice that turned my spine to ice. Not furious, not threatening, calm, possessive, like he believed he was retrieving something that belonged to him. Drawers slammed open outside. Furniture crashed. The sound of something heavy breaking echoed through the hallway. He wasn't searching for me. He was tearing apart the life I'd built, piece by piece. Then silence, followed by the doorknob shifting under his hand. Metal scraped. He was trying to force it. I pressed myself into the corner, gripping my phone with one hand and a metal hanger with the other, hoping it would slow him if he broke through. His voice came through the wood, low and chilling, asking if I really thought I could turn everyone against him. The door shuddered once, twice, then sirens split the night. Blue and red lights shot through the shattered window. Grant froze, and for the first time, he ran. When officers caught him at the edge of the yard, he looked back at me not angry, not triumphant, just defeated. And I knew my silence had finally broken him. Snow piled in heavy drift the morning of the hearing, the kind that swallowed sound and made Traverse Bay feel smaller than ever. I walked into the courthouse with Ava beside me, boots leaving wet prints on the tile, while Grant was escorted through a separate entrance with his attorney and 2 officers. He no longer wore his uniform. Seeing him without it was the first truth of the day. Inside the courtroom, the air settled into a dense, expectant quiet. When the clerk announced the first piece of evidence, my pulse thudded in my ears. The screen lit up with the clip Zach had given me. Grant, drunk, slamming his fist into a locker, leaning inches from a woman who shrank back each time he yelled. The sound of his voice echoing through the speakers froze the entire room. No one whispered, no one shifted. The truth sat too heavily for anyone to look away. Then Dana was called. She walked to the stand with her chin trembling, but her voice stayed steady as she described the night he shoved her so hard she hit the corner of her kitchen counter and needed 6 stitches. Grant stared at the table, jaw clenched, fingers wrapped tight around a pen as if he could snap it in half. Ava presented the next set of evidence logs from the hidden cameras he installed throughout our home. Timestamps, angles, footage of me walking through rooms I didn't know were being watched. His attorney tried to object, but every log matched his own account of accessing the feeds. The judge asked Grant to stand. He raised his eyes only when he was ordered to. The judge's voice cut through the silence, asking if he understood that I hadn't stayed quiet out of fear. But because he'd convinced me, no one would ever believe me. For the first time, I saw something collapse in him. His hands shook. The ruling came down swiftly, a long-term protective order, a formal criminal investigation into stalking and forced entry, permanent removal from his station, and the case transferred to the Grand Traverse prosecutor's office. When I stepped out into the cold, my breath left my body in one long exhale, rising into the air like something finally released. The cracks in my doorframe were still there, splintered reminders of the night everything shattered. I didn't fix them. Not yet. They were proof I had stood through something meant to break me. Instead, I changed the locks, replaced the curtains, and moved the dining table back to where I always wanted it, somewhere he never let it stay. On my first morning after the hearing, I cooked breakfast the way I used to before fear rearranged my life. Eggs, warm waffles, a pot of coffee filling the kitchen with a scent that didn't feel like a performance anymore. None of it was for peacekeeping. None of it was to avoid an argument. It was simply because I wanted to taste a morning that belonged only to me. I opened the window, and the cold air carried in a view I hadn't slowed down to feel in years. Traverse Bay was loosening its grip on winter. Sheets of ice drifted across the gray-green water, breaking apart in gentle, wandering pieces. I inhaled deeply and felt my chest expand without that familiar tightness. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive in my own home. With my hand over my heart, I whispered words I'd held inside for far too long. My silence had kept me alive, but it no longer defined me. This wasn't a story about fear. It was the moment I finally chose myself and the day the lake, and my life began to thaw.